can continue here with the presentation of Ms. Iva Ilieva Hamel. Ms. Iva Ilieva is Senior Economist and Country Representative of the World Bank Group on the presentation on how about the GCC and global economic governance. Thank you very much, Ms. Iva.
Thank you, Dr. Castaneda, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. Thank you for inviting me to join this very interesting discussion. So I would like to speak a little bit about, of course, the GCC perspective of economic governance, the view of the World Bank on what some of the needed reforms are in the GCC going forward, with the focus on structural reforms, but also speak a bit about the very successful initiatives that we have seen coming out of the GCC in terms of structural reforms and in response to the pandemic. So this is kind of the big picture of what I'd like to touch upon. As we know, with COVID, we had a twin shock for the GCC countries, both as the drop in oil prices weighed very heavily on fiscal revenues. We had pandemic-related disruptions, which brought the general economic activity virtually to a standstill. Especially in the initial lockdown stages. And then we asked ourselves, okay, then how are the GCC countries coping with the crisis, but also planning for the recovery? Prior to the pandemic, the GCC had very long-term structural challenges to the economies. All of them had to lessen their dependence on oil, improve the competitiveness of the private sector and the efficiency of the public sector, and also rethink all the social safety nets. With COVID-19, this whole process was essentially accelerated. Even before the pandemic, growth in the GCC had weakened, dropping to 0.8% in 2019. And with the crisis, growth went even further down, and in 2020 was close to negative 6%. The post-pandemic recovery, in our view, will require this sustained commitment to a very healthy mix of policies that pursue reforms to facilitate more private sector activities that would help diversify the economies. As we know, state entities occupy a very large share of GCC economies, providing direct employment to not most, but to a large percentage of citizens. They also crowd out private activities from financial and product markets. Setting up frameworks for public-private partnerships will be important across the GCC, not only to better manage public investment, but also to attract more private and foreign investment. Also, improving competition across factor markets will be critical to reform rigid labor markets, which we see in a number of GCC countries. They're nowadays often designed to channel cheap foreign labor to firms in non-traded sectors, whose business model is heavily dependent on state spending, like payrolls that finance household consumption and procurement. We also need to see labor market reforms that reduce distortions and also allow women to participate fully in the economy. Those will be critical. This requires a very fundamental rethink of the social contract in the GCC and a move away from the omnipresent government, which we see in many of the countries, to increase reliance on robust competition and private sector-led job creation. What we have seen in response to the pandemic has actually been a very healthy response to some of the challenges posed. Many GCC countries continue to pursue very important structural reforms during the pandemic, despite a large emphasis placed on combating the health crisis. What we saw was that battling the pandemic obviously absorbed most of the policymakers' attention, but a number of very important structural reforms were pursued. The World Bank's GCC team is now tracking those reforms, and we found a number of key themes that were addressed during the pandemic and in response to the pandemic. This to us gives cause for optimism going forward. And I will now speak a little bit about these different themes that we've seen. On the labor market front, in Saudi Arabia, for example, as part of the new labor market strategy, Saudi Arabia replaced the existing sponsorship system, kafala, which governed foreign worker mobility and introduced a minimum wage. Bahrain established an Anamal Hope Fund to support young entrepreneurs and businesses to provide startup investment for young Bahrainians' business ideas. In terms of competition policy, Kuwait established a competition protection law to bring more independence to the Kuwait Competition Agency, making a purely technical and professional body to reduce political pressures in performing its mission. In Qatar, a new cabinet resolution confirmed the areas in which non-Qataris may own and benefit from real estate, and the terms, conditions, benefits, and procedures for their own ownership and use of them. In the UAE, a new decree allows full foreign ownership of onshore companies. In terms of social services reforms, also we saw good progress. In Oman, subsidies for water and electricity are now better targeted towards the poorest segments of the population to increase impact and reduce the fiscal burden. In Saudi Arabia, a water transmission and technology company was launched, a state-owned entity that will manage the transmission, distribution, and storage of desalinated water. Another theme that has been also well covered in the media has been the women's economic empowerment and legal reforms. And this is a topic that I'm quite passionate about and have been personally involved in. Great progress was seen both in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and later on in Kuwait and Bahrain. Saudi Arabia was the first in the GCC to enact a very ambitious package of gender legal reforms, which introduced historical reforms to women's legal rights, such as really introducing freedom of movement for women without husbands or guardians' permission. We saw introduction of many laws on equal credit, equal access to credit, non-discrimination in employment. We saw the introduction of the concept of equal pay for work of equal value, and so on. And we already have some evidence on the impact of these reforms on female labor force participation in Saudi Arabia. In fact, it has been increasing at a steady pace while male labor force participation remained flat during the pandemic. We've seen similar reforms in the UAE. We saw the first in the region introduction of parental leave here in the UAE, not just in the GCC, but in the Middle East, which was a historic reform. We also saw the introduction of non-discrimination in access to credit, equality in employment, equal pay for work of equal value, and so on. We also see the ripple effect of Saudi Arabia and the UAE leading this trend. We now see similar initiatives in Kuwait and Bahrain, and we hope that more countries in the region will follow suit. Whether the region pulls quickly out of the crisis, we feel will depend largely on these kinds of policy responses of the authorities, their appetite to take bold actions in the face of unprecedented uncertainty, volatility, and risk. For us, it is encouraging to see that for now, the reform momentum continues, and the GCC countries can take succor from this long performance and continue to learn from each other going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Iba. I think this is a very interesting landscape of many initiatives